In this episode of True Crime Black, we look at the disappearances of two young black men. In the first case, a young man is set to testify against the man that robbed him at gunpoint. He disappears without a trace before getting a chance to appear in court a second time. Was Henry Baltimore the victim of foul play? Then, we look at the case of a young man who inexplicably vanished. The investigators have next to nothing to work with in his case, and it remains a mystery to this day. What happened to Jason Ellis? With that said, let's get started. March 3, 1973, marked a turning point in Henry Baltimore's life. In his East Lansing, Michigan apartment, two individuals forcibly entered and proceeded to rob him. At the age of 21, Henry endured the terrifying ordeal of being bound and struck with a pistol, rendering him completely defenseless while the intruders pillaged the premises he shared with three roommates. Roy Davis, one of the perpetrators, was apprehended several weeks later, thanks to Henry's positive identification. On May 24, 1973, Henry provided testimony against Roy during a preliminary hearing and was slated to testify again once the case progressed to the circuit court. Tragically, less than a week later, Henry mysteriously disappeared without leaving a single trace. Even after 5 decades, his ultimate fate remains an enigma. Henry, an accomplished student, held the status of a junior pursuing a double major in music and social science, with aspirations of becoming a social worker. He possessed a deep affection for Michigan State University and served as the drum major for the university's esteemed marching band, the Spartans. Notably, he held the distinction of being the first African American to hold this prestigious position in the institution's history. On the evening of Wednesday, May 30, 1973, Henry informed his roommates that he intended to visit the university's library, where he held a part-time job. Later that night, when his sister, Laurel Baltimore, arrived at his apartment to retrieve a document she planned to type for him, she discovered Henry's car parked outside, his belongings untouched in his room, but Henry himself was nowhere to be found. Henry's absence persisted throughout the night, causing his loved ones to grow increasingly concerned for his safety. They promptly contacted the East Lansing Police Department, seeking assistance and attempting to report him as a missing person. However, they were met with the discouraging response that they must wait at least 48 hours before filing an official report. Despite the passage of 2 days, Henry remained unaccounted for, compelling authorities to formally declare him as a missing person. Initially, investigators entertained the notion that Henry may have purposefully vanished, driven by a desire to avoid testifying against Roy Davis in the imminent trial set to commence the following week. But after a few days had elapsed, they conceded that the possibility of his abduction could not be dismissed. On June 5, 1973, the police department released a statement regarding the case, acknowledging, "The circumstances surrounding Henry's disappearance are dubious, and foul play is suspected." During the incident in March 1973, Henry found himself alone among his roommates when the perpetrators forcefully entered their apartment. He was swiftly subdued, bound, and subjected to brutal pistol whipping. Helplessly, he could only bear witness as the intruders ransacked the premises, making off with various items including clothing, a watch, golf clubs, and $110 in cash before departing. Amidst the chaos of the robbery, Henry's eyes locked onto the face of one of the assailants, Roy Davis, a familiar face and albeit a casual acquaintance. The second man accompanying Roy was a complete stranger to Henry. Roy, aware of Henry's occasional marijuana usage in the past, seemed to have developed the belief that Henry was in possession of a substantial amount of pot that he kept in his apartment. He demanded to know the whereabouts of Henry's alleged stash, growing increasingly enraged upon discovering Henry had no such stash in his possession. Initially hesitant to report the crime, Henry's reluctance likely stemmed from the genuine fear of revenge. Then, the following week, he mustered the courage to approach the authorities, providing a detailed account of the incident. With unwavering certainty, Henry identified Roy Davis as one of the perpetrators and willingly agreed to testify against him during the upcoming preliminary hearing. Roy, upon learning that Henry had taken the matter to the police, proceeded to do something very surprising. In an attempt to rectify the situation, he returned all the stolen items to Henry and begged him to retract the charges. Sensing an opportunity to put all of this behind them, Henry visited the police once again, expressing a change of heart and his disinterest in pursuing prosecution against Roy. That didn't fly with the police. Law enforcement officials remained very focused on prosecuting Roy and refused to drop the charges. In yet another surprising move, Henry resorted to bargaining with Roy. He proposed a compromise where he would provide mild testimony to ensure that Roy's punishment would not be severe. When the day eventually came for Roy's preliminary hearing, Henry failed to make an appearance in court. Since he held the status of a crucial witness, the court found it of the utmost importance that he be present. For that reason, the court responded by issuing a bench warrant for his arrest and imposing a fine of $50 for his non-compliance with the hearing. The preliminary hearing was rescheduled, ultimately taking place on May 24, 1973, where Henry did show up and bravely provided testimony against Roy. Following Henry's testimony, the presiding judge concluded that there existed sufficient evidence to proceed with a trial. Roy, seething with anger, directed verbal threats toward Henry. In a concerning encounter, George Heath, one of Henry's roommates, was present at the apartment when Roy paid an unwelcome visit shortly after the hearing. Roy confronted Henry, warning him, "Hey man, that wasn't mild stuff. You keep that up, and you're going to be in big trouble. I ain't got nothing to lose at this point." Alarming circumstances unfolded less than a week later when Henry suddenly vanished, leaving behind a void of unanswered questions. On June 1, 1973, Roy's arraignment took place in Ingham County Circuit Court. Following the payment of bail, he was released, but no specific trial date was set. Detectives candidly acknowledged that unless Henry resurfaced, the charges against Roy would likely be dismissed. The immediate belief was a certainty that Roy was behind his sudden disappearance. But, as investigators would look into that theory, they were unable to uncover any evidence supporting the hypothesis of his abduction. Some investigators even entertained the notion that Henry orchestrated his disappearance, driven by a desire to evade testifying against Roy in court. Their argument hinged on the fact that Henry had failed to attend the initial preliminary hearing, suggesting that his vanishing act may have been a deliberate strategy to avoid testifying. Nonetheless, witnesses came forward, recounting sightings of Roy forcefully banging on Henry's apartment door on the day of his disappearance. This testimony was sufficient to convince Henry's loved ones and acquaintances that foul play was involved in his puzzling absence. Contrary to the theory that Henry deliberately skipped the first preliminary hearing out of fear, his sister provided a significant revelation. She explained that Henry's absence from court that day was not due to fear but rather because she had sustained a leg injury, rendering her unable to drive. In a selfless act of prioritizing his sister's well-being, Henry chose to accompany her to the hospital instead of attending the hearing. This account was corroborated by officials from the University Health Center, who confirmed Henry's presence with his sister, Laurel, on the scheduled day of the hearing. Henry's father expressed his conviction that his son did not vanish voluntarily, asserting, "I'm pretty sure he did not run, and if he did, he would run home scared." He emphasized that Henry cherished his Buick Electra and would not have disappeared without it. Henry's sister shared the same sentiment, attesting, "He is too conscientious about his schoolwork to take off like that." Approximately 1 month after Henry's disappearance, a reward of $1,000 was offered for any information leading to his whereabouts. The sum had been raised through contributions from various businesses in Henry's hometown of Jackson, Michigan. Detective James Kelly from East Lansing expressed hope that the reward would generate new leads, as the investigation had hit a standstill. Despite the absence of evidence indicating foul play, there was also a lack of any substantial indications that Henry had left of his own accord, leaving investigators with an ongoing mystery. The FBI took action in Henry's case by distributing missing person flyers bearing his photograph and issuing an alert to state agencies, ensuring that law enforcement across different jurisdictions would be notified if he were encountered. Any police department that came into contact with Henry was instructed to inform the East Lansing detectives promptly. As the fall semester of 1973 began at MSU, Henry should have been commencing his senior year, but his whereabouts remained entirely unknown. Detective Kelly candidly acknowledged that the investigation had left investigators perplexed. He stated, "He has either done a good job of hiding himself or somebody else has done a good job of hiding him. The investigation is at an absolute dead end." In the absence of Henry's testimony, Roy's case proceeded, culminating in his conviction for a lesser charge of felonious assault in October. While awaiting sentencing, Roy professed his confusion with regard to Henry's disappearance, expressing a sincere wish for Henry's return. He conveyed to investigators, "I wish he would show up. The whole thing is really hurting me. You just have to know the judge is going to take all this stuff about me being responsible into consideration. I'd be even happier than his parents if he showed up tomorrow." Roy adamantly denied ever threatening Henry, expressing his understanding that Henry had no choice but to testify and expressing no anger towards him. He even mentioned playing cards with Henry approximately a week after his testimony, indicating that Henry did not display any signs of fear. Roy firmly maintained his innocence, stating, "If there's been any foul play, it sure doesn't involve me." Henry's family, on the other hand, remained uncertain about whether to believe Roy's claims. Laurel, in particular, commented on her lack of personal acquaintance with Roy but revealed that conversations with some of his acquaintances painted a different picture. They suggested that Roy was capable of inflicting harm on others. Laurel emphasized that Henry, as an intelligent and ambitious young man with a promising future ahead, would never willingly abandon his aspirations and abruptly leave his life behind. Tragically, by the conclusion of 1973, Henry's case had gone cold. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, due to his status as an adult and a black man, his disappearance failed to garner significant attention from the media, causing his case to quickly fade from public consciousness. Despite this, Henry's family remained unwavering in their search for him, and over time, even investigators conceded that foul play was likely involved in his vanishing. As the years turned into decades, the enigma surrounding Henry's fate persisted. In 2010, East Lansing Police Chief Tom Wilbert acknowledged that the missing person case remained open and active, yet no new leads had surfaced in years. He expressed the disheartening reality, stating, "There is no evidence of anything. He just disappeared." Henry's disappearance left a profound impact on his loved ones. In 2014, Laurel reflected on the devastating effect it had on their family, particularly her parents, who clung to hope that one day they would have answers, that Henry would unexpectedly walk through the door with his familiar smile. But sadly, that long-awaited moment never came to reality. Instead, they were left with an unfillable void in their hearts, forever burdened by the agonizing uncertainty of what truly happened to Henry. To this day, the disappearance of Henry Baltimore remains a mystery.